In the warm, sunny seasons, we've many good reasons to get some garden work done. Planting seeds and pulling weeds, anything the good earth needs. Garden work is so much fun. Annuals, perennials, veggies and biennials. Garden work is so much fun. Hosta glades and apple trees, carrots, cukes and fresh sweet peas. Garden work is never done.
I've been hearing a lot about heirloom tomatoes lately. I've seen them advertised as in restaurants and at the farmers market. They command a premium price, and even saw them at the state fair, the special category for them. And I don't know what they are. Now, you're the winner of the great vegetable contest out there at the Minneapolis Garden Club show. So I figured you'd know. What do you know about heirloom tomatoes?
Well, an heirloom tomato is a tomato that has one parent, so that it's true to its kind. The hybrids that most of us are used to have two parents that have been crossed to get the best properties of both parent. So most of the heirloom tomatoes came to the U.S. because as people immigrated here, they brought their favorite tomatoes and saved the seeds. And as a child, I was introduced to tomatoes that were heirloom tomatoes, but I didn't realize it.
Really?
My grandmother used to grow these little yellow pear tomatoes that she used in tomato preserves, and my sister and I would sneak them every chance we get because they were so good. And then she had some that were shorter, smaller. They were called Tiny Tims, and they would be little cherry tomatoes. Those we could pick, but she would grow them in pots. And so for someone that has a deck or where they don't have a large garden like I do, that might be an heirloom tomato they might like to try for salads.
So why haven't I heard about them before? What kind of tomatoes have we been growing here?
Well, in the 40s, a lot of the growers were trying to hybridize tomatoes because heirloom tomatoes typically are very hard to handle because the skins are very delicate. They come in all different kinds of flavors and colors, and most people like the red tomatoes, so they were more the hybridized tomatoes that people were looking for. And now we're getting back to enjoying more of those different flavors and colors, and so they've become more popular through the last few years.
I see. So the merchants were making them for eye appeal, and so they could ship them across town or across the country, and
Right.
and they'd last a long time on the shelf.
Correct.
And you and I are interested in what they taste like.
Right. We like the sweet, juicy ones.
Well, you and I don't have to ship them anywhere.
Exactly. I just come down to the garden and bring them in and have my BLT.
So where does one get heirloom tomatoes? You grow them from seeds? You grow them from plants you buy, or what do you do?
You can buy either seeds or plants. If people have never started plant or
I don't know anything
seeds,
about this.
okay,
What should I do?
then what I would do is I would buy plants. And you can buy plants from Totally Tomatoes is a good source, or from Seed Savers, which do all heirloom seeds. And now a lot of the farmers markets also have heirloom plants for sale. If you're more experienced, you could try them from seed like I do.
So what do you do when you grow them from seed? Is this pretty hard, or?
Not really. In March, I put a few seeds into some soil and I put them under a grow light and on a little heat blanket.
Oh, you do it indoors then?
Indoors, yes. And in a couple of weeks, you'll see the little tomatoes come up. And then in about 6 weeks, I transplant those little seedlings into little bigger pots, 2 by 2 inch pots, and I plant them real deep. And I put them back under the grow lights, and then right after Memorial Day, when the soil is nice and warm, I put them in my garden.
So now I've got these things, and they're getting pretty big now. And when do I know it's safe to put them outside?
You want to make sure that your soil temperature is warm. A lot of people rush tomatoes and they try and put them out too early before Memorial Day, and your ground soil temperatures aren't high enough, so all they do is they just stand there and don't grow. And so if you wait until the soil temperatures have picked up before you put them out, then in the warm soil temperatures they'll grow faster and be more vibrant plants.
How do I know what the soil temperature is?
Well, there are thermometers. Usually what I do is I just wait until after Memorial Day weekend or the weekend after, and put them out at that time. Usually what I do is when I plant the tomatoes, I like to use a slow release balanced fertilizer. And so I will usually plant my tomatoes deep, so that even though the tomato might be 6 inches, 8 inches tall, I pick off all the lower leaves and put it down so it's only about 2 inches above the soil. And then I use cardboard around. What I actually do is I take cardboard milk cartons and cut them into about 3-inch high sections, and I sink those down in the ground about 1 inch, because with those tender new plants, cutworms like to get them.
And that will keep them out, huh?
And that keeps the cutworms out. And then I put the balanced fertilizer, about 1/4 of a cup around each plant. And then in about 6 weeks or so, I come through, or when the plant is about 2 feet tall, I come through and I rip those cardboard collars off. And that's when I put my tomato cages with the stakes up around my tomatoes, and then start training them into those tomato cages.
Some of your tomatoes get pretty darn tall, don't they? How big do these heirlooms get?
Well, there are two kinds of tomatoes. The ones that grow to a certain height and produce kind of all at once. Heirloom tomatoes instead are indeterminate, yes, are indeterminate tomatoes. And so they keep producing tomatoes all through the year, and they keep on growing.
That sounds great.
So I let mine continue to grow, and so I have fairly tall cages. And then about the middle of August, I start cutting the tops off, because those tomatoes will not mature. There isn't enough growing season left.
So which ones are your favorites? Which ones are the best ones?
I have favorites for different things. So the favorite one to can or freeze would be Brandywine, and Brandywine comes hybridized also, but the heirlooms have much more flavor. I love Boxcar Willie for BLTs, because it's a huge tomato, so that one slice will cover the whole slice of bread.
Terrific.
I like the Roma type tomatoes, because those work well with making juices or spaghetti sauce, and I like to dry those also. So it depends upon what I'm going to use them for, so I usually plant a variety.
And do you have some you could show us right here?
Absolutely, I can. Would you like to try a taste of each of these?
You bet I would.
Okay, let's try this one, because this one is the Brandywine, and it's kind of the gold standard of tomatoes in the flavor. So I'm going to let you try this and see what you think of that one.
Okay. You going to try it too?
Sure.
Wow.
It has really full flavor, and
That's perfect.
let's try a different one. This Redfield Beauty is a pink tomato.
I see.
But I like it because it's a nice meaty tomato. It has good flavor. Maybe not quite as much flavor as the Brandywine that we just tasted. But for freezing and canning, it fits nice in the jars. It has good flavor.
Oh my gosh, it's a slippery one too.
Yes.
Oh, that's good too.
Not as sweet.
Not as sweet.
Then let's try some different things. This
Oh.
is Aunt Ruby's German Green,
A green one.
a green one.
That's not because it isn't ripe. It's supposed to be
It's
green.
supposed to be green.
How do you know when it's ripe?
Yes, exactly. How do you know when it's ripe? It's all by feel. And usually what I like to do, because their skins are so delicate, I try and bring them in maybe a day before I'm going to use them, because then I'm not as likely, and I carry them in a cardboard box. If you use a basket or something, the skin is so tender you could puncture it.
Really?
So I try and pick them in maybe a day ahead of time.
No wonder they can't ship these around the country.
Right, they're difficult. So try this one. See what you think of a green tomato. All my friends are reluctant with this one because they're not used to green tomatoes.
It's perfectly ripe.
Now, this is my husband's favorite tomato, Dr. Waikiki on BLTs, because it's big, and some people have problems with tomatoes being too acidic. And this one isn't as acidic, and so he likes this one better because it's not as acidic. But it's a nice meaty tomato, and one slice will cover his whole sandwich. So you should try this one and see what you think of Dr. Waikiki.
Bread for BLTs.
Right.
That would be good with the BLT.
And this is my favorite for BLTs. Last year, this one is 1 3/4 pounds. Last year I had one that went to 2 pounds.
My
And
gosh.
so one tomato will feed a family of 4 BLTs.
I'll bet it would.
So with this one, let's try some of him. So guess what we're having tonight for dinner?
BLTs.
BLTs.
Now, do they all slice so well as this, or do you have a special knife for this?
No, because the skins are so much more tender. They slice easier than the hybridized ones, but they don't ship as well.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, let's try this one. See what you think of Boxcar Willie.
Okay. So my daughter that hates the skins on them won't complain about these because
Well,
they'll be
right,
very thin.
They're easier, right. A little sweeter.
Very, very sweet.
Has all the flavor of the brandy wine,
It does, but it's big enough for a BLT.
but it's big enough for a BLT. Now, the only one that we haven't tasted is a speckled Roman. And I like to use the Roman or Roma tomatoes, these pear-shaped tomatoes. They're more Italian-based or Mediterranean-based tomatoes. I like to use them to make juice or my spaghetti sauce kinds of things. And I also use them to dry because there isn't as much juice. So when I do dried tomatoes and I do mine in the oven, I don't have a dryer, but
How about the sun-dried tomatoes?
this would be just like a sun-dried tomato. So I just slice them in thin slices like this and then dry them in the oven, usually overnight.
You ever eat them just like this?
I do, but they're a little stronger tomato flavor. So see what you think
Okay, let
when
me
you
try
taste
this.
these. Not quite as juicy,
If I wouldn't have tasted all the others, I would have said this was just fine.
but now you see the difference.
I sure do. Okay, I'm sold, Judy. I want to grow some of these things now.
Okay, Bob.
I'd like to get some more information, things I could read, because I'm going to forget a lot of this stuff we've talked about today. What can I read? Where can I get
There's
some
a couple of really good books, Bob. One is this 100 Heirlooms of American Gardens by Carol Mayle. And it has excellent pictures on how to identify, and she gives a nice little scenario on flavors and problems and pluses of each of the tomatoes. And then both of these also show you how to ferment the seeds, so that if you wanted to save your own seeds, you could do that. But there's a nice piece on that and a nice piece on how to handle different diseases with the tomatoes. And then the other book that I would recommend, Bob, is The Heirloom Tomato from Garden to Table by Amy Goldman. And this has just wonderful pictures in it, but it also, because I like to eat tomatoes, has a wonderful recipe section in the back.
Terrific.
Today we're at the garden of Kay Wolf and Gary Opperman, and we're here to talk a little bit about herbs. Unlike some members of the garden club like me, Kay and Gary grow herbs and actually use them in cooking. So Kay, why don't you tell us a little bit about your garden?
Well, we started the herb garden, I think, almost 20 years ago, and it's located right outside the back door. And it's a small size. It's only about 4 by 8 feet, just a little less than that. And it's right next to the patio stones that go through the side yard. Our side property is only about 15 feet from the house to the lot line. And so it's kind of a throughway, but the herbs are right there in the middle because they say you should have herbs next to a pathway because if you brush them as you go by, they give off their scent. And my husband Gary is not a gardener, but he is a wonderful cook, a great chef, and so he uses all the herbs. I don't usually fertilize the herb garden. I just use normal garden soil. I understand that herbs grow better and produce more resins and more flavors if they're growing a little on the lean side. And for design interest, I add some other herbs with colored leaves, some of which I don't use, but just so they look pretty. And then I usually add a few little annuals along the edge just for color. The oldest plant we have is a French tarragon. That's a perennial. It comes up every year. And it gets to be about, this time of year, it's a real bush. It's about 3 or 4 feet high. And I have cut it in half now just so it doesn't flop over and it'll all get new growth. It's best, I think, to use it fresh. And Gary likes to tuck it under the skin of the chicken before grilling. Adds a wonderful flavor.
Sounds wonderful.
And uses it in vinaigrette salad dressings. And then in the fall, we also harvest it. We hang it to dry, and then after a couple weeks when it's totally dry, store the leaves in a jar. Another perennial that comes up every year, of course, are the chives. And they're, I think, best early in the spring when they're just really tender and green. They're great in scrambled eggs. And just a little while ago, I cut out the blooms. I do let them bloom just because I like the blossom so much. But now the plant will make fresh growth, and so for salads, I go out and just find those little fresh shoots and cut them off. Another perennial that's a favorite of Gary's is the sage plant, and that comes up every year. I think sometimes sage might not be hardy, but this particular one we've had for quite some time. It's great used fresh. One of his best dishes is using it on grilled catfish. Just rub the catfish with olive oil, add the sage, grill, and then squeeze a fresh lime over it when you're done. Again, we harvest a lot of that in the fall. It's great dried. Hang it up, store the leaves in a jar, or make a rub. Another plant in the herb garden is parsley. I get the triple curled parsley, and parsley is a biennial. So on the second year it flowers, and it might not have a much different of a flavor, but it's much more coarse. So I just buy a fresh parsley plant and put it in fresh every year. One of our favorites are basils. We grow quite a basil crop in the summer, sweet basil, and we found that they're better grown in pots. We get them up off the ground, they get hotter and stay drier, and especially the way this June has been where it's cold and wet. We found if we put the basil plants in the ground, they just don't do well and tend to not flourish. So we use a lot of fresh basil in the summer, lots of uses for that. One of my favorites is just a salad with tomatoes and basil and salt and pepper, and just toss it all around and let it sit for a while and then serve it. You need to pinch off all the blooms on all herbs, but especially basil, because later in the summer basil will start to bloom. And I think the basil tastes sweetest early in the season. Later in the year it gets more of a licorice flavor, but Gary likes that licorice flavor, so we each have our preferences. To harvest it, we haven't found good luck retaining the flavor by drying it, so we chop it up, mix it with a little olive oil. We don't bother to make pesto, just mix it with olive oil, and then freeze it in ice cube trays. And then we just pop them out of the trays into a bag and throw a cube of basil in a pot of soup in winter, and it works wonderfully.
Sounds delicious.
Another annual that we really like to use is rosemary. We use it a lot fresh. It's really great on poached or grilled salmon. And rosemary is great harvested and dried, and it can be stored, the leaves can be stored in a jar also. Another annual is French thyme. Now, there's lots of different kinds of thyme, and we just kind of go to the herb growers and pick off the leaves and taste them and decide which ones we like best. French thyme's one of our favorite, and it's great used fresh. You can just pick a whole stem and throw the whole stem into a pot of soup or in a sauce or braise. And then the leaves fall off while it's simmering, and then I just take the twig out when I'm done and not worry about taking the leaves off the stem. The thyme likes growing over rocks, or you can put it on the edge of a pot and it'll just hang off the edge. And I use it fresh way into the fall after everything else is dried. It might even have frozen once, but the little leaves are still on those twigs and they're still very flavorful. You can harvest thyme also and dry it. It's just great. Hang it up to dry and then store it in a jar. So my recommendation would be just try herb varieties that you like. We just go to the growers at the farmers market and taste the leaves and experiment and try what you like.
Welcome to our Ask the Expert segment today. Our guest today is Jerry Shannon, who is an incredibly experienced gardener. He and his wife Lee have a garden in St. Paul that comprises the inside of a city block. Jerry, can you talk first for a few minutes about the challenges of gardening in an urban environment? You're right in the city of St. Paul. A lot of us are suburban gardeners and maybe have a little different set of circumstances than you have to deal with. What are some of the challenges you face, and maybe even have some advantages gardening right in the city?
Well, I look at it as having more advantages than the disadvantages. I've been gardening since 1967, 40 some years, and I've really found that the climate and weather has changed significantly in our garden over the last 20 years, and it's become warmer. The winter evenings are less intense and less cold. The snow amount varies, And this year was particularly good because we had so much snow for winter protection, and snow is your best winter protection. So we grow a lot of plants that I always have the idea that I would say the plants don't read the books.
Okay.
And so the zone hardiness of plants have so many factors and so much dependency on so many factors other than just cold. And in Minnesota, more plants die not from the cold, but from the spring wet. And plants not growing in soil that has well-drained soil. And so if you notice how the snow melts in the spring, it melts from the top down. So oftentimes you get puddling around the stems and crowns of plants, which rot them out. And so consequently, a lot of those plants are killed in the spring because that water doesn't drain away. And then the root system gets saturated and the roots gets destroyed too. Matter of fact, the root systems are the most tender part of your plant. And more plants die because of the root damage than bud damage or anything above the ground, except if it's eaten by predators that are feeding on it. Every individual garden has a lot of microclimates within the garden. And these microclimates are, so if you had a temperature probe out in your yard in different areas and different spots, you'll find that within these microclimates, the temperatures can be a lot different in different parts of your yard. And the other factor that desiccates trees, and we see this lots of times in the spring with winter damage in evergreens, especially in evergreens and leaves on rhododendrons, things that don't lose their leaves, where they turn brown is actually winter desiccation. And a lot of the theory has to do with sun scald, what is not so much sun scald as just the plant can't take up any moisture. And the dry northwest winds suck the water right out of those leaves. And if you can protect those plants from that northwest wind in the wintertime, you can oftentimes not have that kind of problem of browning of the leaves and foliage.
What are some of the techniques that you use to do that?
Okay, what we've done is we planted large evergreens on the west and north side of our property. These evergreens protect those plants from northwest winds. Then also they act as snow fences. If you remember snow fences on the highways to keep the snow from drifting on the highways, those evergreens stop that wind, and then the snow drops on the leeward side of those trees, and so the snow is much deeper through those beds that are protected from those evergreens because the snow is dropped there and not blown elsewhere in the yard.
Well, I've been talking with Jerry Shannon, who is one of the more experienced gardeners I know. He's a member of the Men's Garden Club of Minneapolis, and he's been our guest on Ask the Expert.